Hafaday, Girawami, and welcome back to the Northern Marianas Humanities Council continuing series on racial equality and civil unrest. And as I mentioned before, this series is focusing specifically on the disproportionate number of African Americans that are discriminated against by either individuals or institutions in America. We were hoping that our discussions will help facilitate a deeper understanding of these issues and discussion, and we're taking it from both a national and a local perspective. I'm Catherine Perry, and we're joined today by journalist Thomas Manglone. Thomas, thanks for being here.
No problem. Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this important work, and I'm excited to see all the conversations you're going to have.
For those of you that may not know, Thomas has worked for different media outlets in both the region and locally. He's now with KUAM News in Guam, and he is also the founding member of the Pacific Islander Journalism Task Force under the Asian American Journalists Association. Wow, that's groundbreaking.
Yeah, it's a great group, and I have to give a shout out to fellow Chamorro and Saipanese, Anita Hofschneider, who's also a founding member with me, and Rachel Ramirez, who's also from Saipan, and Lauren Kawana. So we just recently launched that task force to address specific Islander issues, but also for the context of this program, also just to generally look at how media can do better when it covers communities of color.
Oh, and he's let the cat out of the bag. We're talking about that institution that we all utilize every day, if not all day, and that is media. And we wanted to talk specifically about how the media and social media relate to civil unrest and racial equality. Let's start with the basics. What is media, and what is it? How is it supposed to function when it's functioning properly in our society?
Well, that's a huge question. I think even as a journalist myself, still studying journalism as well, I'm constantly thinking of what that is. But for me, I think what it counts for is really anything throughout any medium. So whether that's print, audio, or video, that's what you can classify as media. I think often though, when people think of what's called the fourth estate, or media as an institution, as you described it, oftentimes there are these sweeping images of large sets and busy newsrooms. And yes, that is a form of media, but I think, like we were discussing before we started recording, that the audience is also part of that atmosphere and that ecosystem. What you post on Instagram, what you post on Twitter is often called citizen journalism, but that's just a fancy word for saying media as well. So really, if you have a phone, if you produce anything that is posted or published, you are a part of media and you're producing media.
If you're on a shoestring production set like this, we are media.
Yeah.
So are the lines blurred between media, what we traditionally know as media, and social media today? Is it all pretty much the same, or are there differences we should be aware of?
I think it depends who you ask. I think there are people in the field who definitely would love to see a more distinct line drawn between what we see as the traditional media gatekeepers with mainstream media, as people call it these days. And then you have other folks, who continue to want to be in that citizen journalism category, wanting to be away from the establishment of what traditional media does. I think for me though, it is becoming more blended. As a younger journalist, as a up and coming reporter, I think that the lines should be blurred in the sense that it creates more participation. It democratizes the information.
What do you mean by that?
It makes the information more able to be engaged with and influenced by the public that it's for. And so I'm always a fan of empowering audiences. I think that media is not always just talking to people. It's always also keeping a pulse of what the people are looking for. And so when I say democratize media, it's putting the power back into audiences and people who watch media as not simply media lecturing to them, but media being in conversation to them. Kind of what you're doing today, and that's what I love about that aspect of it.
How do you maintain a level of objectivity, which is so important, when you like in today's world, you have so many citizens also contributing to the news cycle. What is the balance today, and what should we be looking for or concerned about when we're consuming something out of traditional media or social media?
And so I actually don't believe in objectivity. I think that that one of the things I've grown up with, just for some backstory, I grew up on Rhoda, and every morning around 6 a.m. I'd wake up waiting for the bus to bring me to elementary school, and I'd watch Christiana Amanpour on CNN because we get the international version here, and she's on at 6 a.m. when I'm getting ready, and so I just chose to watch that instead of some other shows. And one of the things she's always said is truthful, not neutral. And that's something that I've tried to hold in my reporting and encourage my peers and try to pass that on to maybe younger folks in high school and middle school who want to enter the field. And so what does truthful, not neutral mean? I think objectivity as an aspiration is definitely something that folks should continue to hold. It's I think the interpretation most people have is that it's fair and balanced, so to speak. But I think when we take into account truthful and not neutral, when it comes to things like racial injustice, social inequality, that we can see that there are actually lines that are drawn when things are just one side, that is just, there's no false equivalence in the reporting. One example that is often used is that in climate change reporting, 99% of scientists say global warming exists. And 1%, or I guess 0.1% say that it doesn't. But when in the traditional reporting of climate change, we've seen that the scientists who say that it exists are put at the same level as scientists who say that global warming does not exist. And so when we say
it's 99% who say
right, and so there's that false equivalence or false moral equivalence, and so that's why I think I aspire to a truthful, not neutral mantra in my reporting.
Let's talk specifically about how the media has represented different races in our society. Do you feel that the representation is truthful and fair to ethnic minorities or racial minorities?
Yeah, that's a large question. I was just recently on another panel about how territories are represented in media, and obviously political status and race are two different things. But to answer your question, one thing I said there that I also think applies here is that we have an entire historical archive of when media has got it wrong, has got the story wrong. And I think that it depends which ethnic group you're in. I definitely think that in terms of the African American community, the Black community, that they're often overrepresented in sports, in pop culture, and also we only see kind of that spectrum of performance and celebrity or criminal and really violent representations.
Kind of like extremes.
Yeah, both extremes, and there really is nothing in the middle there. And that goes for other communities as well. We often do have that binary thinking of good or bad, and oftentimes it's more nuanced than that. I think especially when it comes to the recent riots that have happened, oftentimes there were so many peaceful protests happening. Yeah. But all we saw, was the violence, and also kind of misquotes of Martin Luther King, who actually said, as many people pointed out, that rioting is a response. Is a language of the unheard. And so I think it depends again what group you're talking about, but all of this to say is that there's a lot of work to be done in those representations. And especially for us as Pacific Islanders as well, living in the territory, there often is no national coverage of us. And when there is, it's either as a war-torn typhoon disaster zone, which is real and is valid, but there are also so much more experiences that we have outside of that. And so it's, again, holding all of those complexities, right? Because they all are true. It's just how do we represent that truthfully in our reporting?
There's a bit of it's partially true that the media reports the news or what's going on, but the media also has a role in creating what is news, what comes before the people, kind of alluding to what you were saying earlier about there was a lot of coverage on riots, not so much peaceful protests. What are some of the considerations the media makes in considering what is newsworthy? And is there truthfulness, truthful, not neutral?
Yeah, Yeah, and so that was Christiana Amanpour who said that, not me. But yeah, I agree with what she said. I think in the industry, there's this saying which you might have heard, and it was popularized by the movie Nightcrawler. I don't know if you've seen that. It's called "If it bleeds, it leads."
I've heard that.
Right, and so and I've seen several journalism students have that on their laptop. It's almost like a battle scar of being a reporter, of saying if it bleeds, it leads. We run to the disaster. We don't run away from the disaster, right? And again, that's the idea of covering everything like a war-torn zone, or covering it like it's a football game and saying there are wins and losses, and there are only two teams in the game. When in fact that's not the case in our real life. And so I think that is also at the root of the issue, is that if you look at a lot of the national studies, or even tune into your news tonight, you will see that oftentimes crime and health issues, I mean, we are in a pandemic, but even outside of a pandemic, those kind of scare factors that often draw readership or viewership are at the top of the list of those of the news coverage, and it's not a secret. There's so many examples out there, including your 6 o'clock news tonight.
This might be a little bit beyond what we originally thought we were going to talk about, but could you speak at all to human psychology and why we tend to gravitate towards the bleeding story, or do we tend to gravitate to stories that affirm what we already believe?
I'm not a psychologist.
He's an incoming graduate student at Stanford University, so I'm throwing these hard questions.
I'm not a psychologist, but I can share what I've heard and what I've learned, and and what I hope to do. I think that one of the things we learned is that oftentimes media's influence can be seen in three different realms. I was once asked, do you think media is descriptive? Do you think media is prescriptive? Or do you think that it's symptomatic? And so, is it prescriptive? Does media tell us what things ought to be? Is it descriptive? Does media just simply be a stenographer, of what's happening around us? Or is it symptomatic? Does media show us what's wrong with the world, and it's showing us, things that that are caused by events? The trick question is always that it's all three, okay. Right? But I think in answering your question, beyond the answer of it draws attention, I think it also is that we live in news cycles as well, and a lot of the intention that we've seen from traditional media is to maintain your attention as much as possible. And so, for example, I've heard from a lot of Black journalists that I know, and also the National Association of Black Journalists, that when covering events such as George Floyd or other police murders or police brutality, that while covering the death and what happened is important, we also have to cover the context around it, right? George Floyd's death is part of a larger systematic issue that the world is facing, that we've seen that folks on island are also caring about, right? We had that huge Black Lives Matter protests on Beach Road. And so I think it's a complicated answer, but I think that when you start talking about nuance, not everyone has time to watch a 2-hour documentary, and we're forced every day and to put a entire history into a 2 or 3 minute news story, and I hope people don't just rely on those news stories and really look at the breadth of a history and life, because I certainly hope that none of my reports are the main source for anyone's complete knowledge on issues, right? We want to make sure that people come to these stories and read, having read other sources, and also other long form material that is more nuanced than what I report.
So when we see these short news stories, and they identify somebody by their race, what are the media guidelines? Are there any media guidelines for identifying somebody by their race? And what should we, as the people viewing that, kind of have our ears pricked up about, like, hey, that wasn't presented well. That wasn't presented truthfully.
Yeah, I think kind of the gatekeeper for that has often been the AP style guide that a lot of journalists look to, even TV journalists. and they actually released some, new guidelines about reporting on these communities recently, as of, I think I saw it just this morning that they released these new guidelines. I haven't read it in full, but they are in the works. I do know that there are so many great organizations like the Asian American Journalists Association, the Native American Journalists Association, the National Association of Black Journalists, and then the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. I mention all of this because they really are dedicated to exactly the questions you're asking. And they provide different guidelines in terms of, when you do mention a person's race, and is that integral to the story?
Is it important?
Is it? And if it is, then it is valid. And I think also looking at other guidelines that also include kind of putting journalists who are from those communities also in the story. That's always the large question I've heard.
I'm seeing a lot more of that, where the reporter actually seems to be a part of the story.
Right, and so where I was coming from with that was the idea that one of the most controversial questions I was faced with as a student with my peers is that if you are of the same ethnic group, should you go and report on them? Yeah. In other words, do you have a bias if there's, a Chamorro rights issue? Yeah. Is sending Tomas the Chamorro reporter the best thing to do for the newsroom? Obviously that is simplistic and kind of, removes all the nuance we were just talking about that we need. But oftentimes from what I hear from my mentors is that you identifying, having that cultural affinity and experience makes you an expert in that field. If you were covering something in the Supreme Court, you would want to send your reporter with a law degree, wouldn't you? Or if you're covering coronavirus, I wish we had more doctors covering coronavirus. I'm covering it right now. I'm constantly trying to read things and make sure I don't get it wrong. Yeah. I'm not a doctor. And so I think that's also becoming a part of the conversation, is not only what's being reported, but also who's reporting it, and not to say that only people who identify with a culture should report on them, but that shouldn't be seen as a setback when editors or news directors are sending people out into the story. But because I've also heard the flip side of how that can be a bad experience when you're the only person of color in the room and they decide just to send you to all the stories that are about that community, because then you become tokenized, right? And that's not what you want in a workplace. It's a professional environment, and while there might be some hidden agendas, you are a professional in that space. And so it works both ways, right? And I think it all relates to what we're talking about.
So we are talking about racial equality and civil unrest. Can you give us some real life examples of when the media and social media have gotten it right when it comes to these issues, they've helped progress the truth, or when they've really caused harm by irresponsible reporting?
Yes, and so I actually saw one bad example play out in the Bay Area when I was there for undergrad, and there was a black girl who was killed at a bus station, at a train station, and the news decided to either unintentionally or intentionally use a photo of her holding a toy gun in the news story talking about her death. Oh. And that's just one very blatant example of when you get it wrong. Yeah. Because again, you're suggesting this person is violent in some way because the gun is in the picture, and again, this person was the victim. Yeah. And so there's that example that I saw the news station apologize for. Yeah. Very. They were very apologetic, but you don't come back from a mistake like that. You lose trust from the community. I think though, also on a larger scale, we see what's happening right now in the Philippines with Maria Ressa from Rappler, who's also a former CNN bureau chief, being convicted of cyber libel, and how social media has kind of also taken away the power that news organizations used to have in terms of gatekeeping the information and deciding what's real and what's not. Now social media has essentially taken away that power, and that's something that Maria Ressa has talked about. And for her situation, not only having that power taken away and being abused on social media for her platform Rappler, but also the president there, Duterte, really pushing for that conviction as well, and really just watching every move that the news organization makes. And so kind of showing how, both on a local level with that one example of the picture, and even on an international scale when you have a president of a country, really targeting a journalist, that's when media, continues to struggle.
I like the fact that you brought up that picture, because that's another important thing to look at also, is the pictures that are selected, for example, to accompany a news story. They can either be flattering to the subject, they can be unflattering, or they can be neutral. Even simple things like the angle of the camera. If the camera's up high looking down at the subject, it's like you're looking down at the person or anything like that.
Yeah, and in recent cases, whenever you see, it's even here in our local media, whenever crime is reported, you often see the photos of the people who are arrested.
Yeah.
There are some news stations across America that are now deciding not to show those photos, not to show the mugshots, because what does it do when you paint a picture, of often darker skinned people, or kind of colorism is what it's called, of always showing kind of that representation of crime, and not really explaining the story itself. And so there are some news stations that I'm aware of that have decided to stop showing photos, because that just continues to perpetuate the idea of criminalization, heightened criminalization in communities of color.
Yeah, I can see why that would be a problem, if that's the image that people are always seeing. But honestly, in my personal opinion, especially if there's a sex offender, I want to know who that person is, especially here in this community. So I think it works for us.
Yeah, and I think the news stations I was alluding to are definitely larger news stations in which, when we're talking about mainstream representation, that's the case. And I do agree that in smaller communities, knowing that, especially when it comes to sex crimes, right?
Yeah.
So,
have you had any personal experience in your career, either as a journalist, or obviously as a journalist, or as an individual who just happens to be in the journalism field, related to social equality, racial inequality?
Yeah, I think especially when I spent my summer in Guam last year at KUAM again, at the height of the protests against the military, or not at the height of the time. It's it's always been an issue for Chamorros on Guam, but when Shoshana Chatfield went ahead with the clearing for the military buildup, around the sacred sites that are there, and it continues to be an issue. And so I think indigenous rights, especially being a reporter here in the Pacific, is always top of mind. That it's just never, this is home for us, and there are indigenous peoples here, and issues affect their livelihoods. And so I think that talking about it from a local experience and my personal point of view, that's not always been a struggle, but always something to keep in mind when we're talking about framing stories and which voices we leverage in terms of what's more important, right? When we talk about military or government strategic importance, or we talk about cultural values and family values and community values.
Yeah, so how did you approach that story?
Well, I approached it in the sense I covered what was happening, and that's the job. You never go in with the agenda of saying I'm going to lift this voice over the other. Mm-hmm. It's simply presenting some of the facts, right? That when there is intervention or excavation, there is also environmental pollution and contamination. Mm-hmm. And those are some of the outstanding facts that you can't just deny. They're right there plain in view. And so I think that when you do have science on your side, it's kind of undebatable to say. And I often also think about it in terms of Mauna Kea and the coverage that happens in Hawaii with the 30-meter telescope that they're trying to build on the sacred mountain, and how people were saying that this is science versus culture. And a lot of people, and including some members of the media, were saying this is business versus culture. This is, if the science is clear that these detrimental impact to the environment will happen. The business aspect is also very clear that this is a money versus culture issue. It's not a science versus culture issue. And I think that when I first heard that from a indigenous scholar, who I can't remember right now, it really brought to life the idea of coverage and how we often do put things in binaries as if it's one team versus the other.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then you reframe it to exactly what that indigenous activist said of business versus community, not science versus community.
You've probably heard the saying, there are two sides to every story, but in media, we say there are at least two sides to every
Right.
story.
At least.
Probably more. I like what
Yeah.
you said in the beginning, which is it's really every reporter or anybody generating social media is coming with a worldview. And it's really unrealistic to think that we can separate that worldview from what they are presenting. And sometimes it's intentional. They have an agenda. Their worldview is their agenda and what they present. And sometimes, even though I would say the reporter is trying to be unbiased, they still have a certain way of looking at things. So how can we, as the, so to say, consumers of media and social media, be more aware of any racial discrimination or the agenda or worldview of the person who is presenting this to us? How can we be more, basically aware and conscious of what we're consuming?
I think for this particular case, definitely follow more Black journalists, more Black scholars, more Black community leaders.
Do you have any resources to recommend?
Everyone's circle is different. I have mine. I'm sure maybe we can include some in the description. I always start with, the National Association of Black Journalists and the work that they're putting out.
Okay.
But I think when it comes to especially our current moment, listening to the margins of the margins, listening to folks who are not always at the center of our conversations, especially here on island, is important. I think outside of that, though, is to just get off Facebook, really.
Wait, did you say get off Facebook?
Get off Facebook.
Okay.
As it, maybe delete your account. I've contemplated it a few times, but all of that to say, maybe not that extreme if you still want to stay connected. It's hard not to. But all of that to say, what I really mean is that you should get the information straight from the sources and from various sources. I read as much as I can from each extreme. Not to be influenced, but to know that there are actual conversations happening on both of those ends. And not to say that I'm in the middle or that I'm immune from both of those conversations, because I have my own biases. But I really encourage everyone to simply read the entire spectrum of what they can as much as they can. And if that means watching 3 videos and one of them is Fox, the other CNN, and the other's MSNBC,
well, that's a lot of news.
Then, watch. Then that's the case. I don't know. I'm kind of giving just duct tape solutions,
Yeah.
but kind of just generally going to multiple sources straight to their source, straight to the source.
Yeah.
And again, following news organizations that do also have that expressed mission to give you racial, equitable coverage, to give you coverage on social injustices that, actually speak to the truth of what's happening on the ground, that not actually everything is not just fire and riots, that there are actual conversations happening, and that's part of the conversation. That's kind of the advice, I guess. And everyone has a different learning process. I know people who only listen to radio or only read print and only watch TV. And whatever you do, I think, just try and exercise the range of the viewpoints, because that's what everyone's talking about. Yeah. When you go to a source, there's at least 100 more people looking at that too.
Yeah. So what would you say is on the horizon for the media in relation to what's happening now in the United States? Or are there changes coming, or what do you feel should be the path forward?
That's a scary question, Catherine. It's scary, especially in a world where we're just seeing like it's, there's almost hopelessness at the same time, while there's huge resilience. Personally, what I'm seeing at least is a huge shift to data journalism and data analysis and reporting, kind of relying on the numbers as to tell the story. And I think that as we shift to maybe more reporting on technology, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, whatever that may be, in this next step of what the world's going to take in its evolution, I think that we also have to be careful not to, I guess, trust the numbers so much, right? Because especially in data journalism, it's being said that you just trust those numbers, right? This is the crime rate for this town, and these are our models to predict where crime will happen. How can you predict where crime will happen? Isn't that such a ridiculous notion to you that they look?
No, don't CIA analysts do a lot of?
But it's again, how do you necessarily? It is problematic to say the least to say that crime will happen at this particular place, right? Or at least, or the type of crime even. I mean, no one has that crystal ball, right? And I think I mentioned that because we also have to be careful when in a new wave of what might be a reliance on data journalism and the data itself, that when it comes to things like predictive policing or that we question how that data was taken as well, that every data point, that every story we tell also exists outside of the frame we're trying to cover it in.
There's more to the story.
There is, and there's always more to the story.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, and this is something that I've heard local journalists say here as well, the only reason why our stories get published is because there's a deadline. I guarantee you, if you ask every journalist if they wanted more time on their story, they'd probably say yes.
Yeah.
At least the good ones, maybe. Some people just want to get over with. I'm just joking. But yeah, I say that all the time. The only reason why I ever send my story is because there's a deadline.
Yeah, you would like to have had more
We
time.
always want more time. I wish we could do a documentary on every single issue, especially here. I mean, but again, what does that require? It requires money.
I was going to say.
And it requires a staff and a workforce, right? And I think that when you take that into account for local journalism here in the Pacific, and also in the States, we're seeing a lot of layoffs right now, reduced hours, reduced pay. Yeah. How can we really expect a vibrant press to cover all of these inequities and injustices if we're stuck in this type of system? So I see, looking ahead, I also see a lot of reformation in how newsrooms are constructed. It's always been a dream for me to start a nonprofit news organization, something kind of untied from corporate interests or any advertiser that might be out there as well. But there's a lot of good work being done, right? I'm 22. I'm just getting started. There are people before me who've always done this work and this advocacy. When we talk in terms of story and storylines, I'm really, at the end part of the book, the next chapter, the end part of this chapter, the next chapter, and a lot of the folks I've seen in local media, like yourself when you started it, and Sabrina Salas Matanani, and just a lot of people in journalism who've continued to hold the line in making sure that we have honest coverage, that we have truthful coverage in the islands.
I want to go back, before I give you time for closing thoughts, to something you said earlier when I asked you about looking to the future in this situation, and you talked about hope. Is there hope, you feel, in your experience as a journalist, for things to get better?
There is hope. There is hope. And I think that what we're seeing, what might be seen as kind of an uprising, is that version of hope too. We have a younger generation, many of whom are my peers as well, kind of not just demanding a seat at the table, but demanding that we shift the table entirely, and that the table sometimes doesn't even exist, right? And so I am hopeful. There's a lot of good work being done in journalism and outside of journalism that really makes me trust the media even more during this time, especially in a time where our president calls us the enemy of the people. It's really important to hold each other even closer And that's why I love local journalism, because we are reporting on our community. And I do see my aunties and uncles in the field. And that in itself is not a bias, that's a connection. And that's accountability, that what you put out impacts your local community. And so yeah, that leaves me hopeful. Yeah.
I really want to thank you for making time and for being a part of this conversation and for sharing your insights and your knowledge. Is there anything else you want to say that maybe I didn't ask about?
No, other than that, I think I want to remind the audience that you are in charge. You're in charge. I think even myself now, I often think of the media as kind of this, sphere, somebody else that is not connected to my well-being or my life. And so I think the audience has all the power in this conversation, and more power than sometimes establishments or media might lead them to believe. And so invest. If you don't have actual money to invest in, invest with your like, with your follow, with your share, with your retweet, with your repost. All of that amounts to something. And actually message your news organizations. That's one of the things I love about working here in the CNMI and in the Marianas in general, is that those calls that we get, those messages that we get on Facebook about concerns, about what's happening down the street, or the basketball court that's never been fixed, those are really matter, and they impact our daily lives. So just reminding the audience that you've got the power to shape the media landscape as well. It's not all just us talking to the public. It's a conversation.
That's really great. Not just a discussion here, but really a call to action for all of us to be an active part of the news cycle that we partake of every day. Thank you so much, Thomas.
Thank you.
We've been chatting today with multimedia journalist Thomas Manglona about the role of the media and social media when it comes to racial equality and civil unrest. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show, so please go ahead and let us know what you think, and we'll be back next time for another in this series. Esta.